especially for women in their childbearing years, that's a lot of stress to put the body under.
Right.
And a lot of women will lose their periods or find changes to their cycle that should be a big red flag that this diet is not necessarily productive.
I wanted to ask why you think carbohydrates have been so demonized in society these days. Phoebe, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You have a book that's been released called Carbivore, but you've already written 4 other books.
Over the years, there was like Atkins in the 90s when we went low fat. What happened was the carb count and everything we ate just went up exponentially. So kind of the example that I give is whole milk yogurt. When you take out the fat, lactose is an actual sugar. So the sugars just go way up. As a result, we also have less fat, less protein to kind of slow our carbs roll to our bloodstream. My biggest pet peeve with the wellness world is that
I'm Radhi Devlukia, and on my podcast, A Really Good Cry, we embrace the real, the messy, and the beautiful, providing a space for raw, unfiltered conversations that celebrate vulnerability and allow you to tune in to learn, connect, and find comfort together. Phoebe, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here, and I cannot tell you how many questions I have for you.
oh my gosh, I'm so ready.
So you have a book that's been released called Carbivore, but you've already written 4 other books, right?
Yes, this is my 4th, and they've, spanned a whole broad range of topics.
Wow. I would love to know how you got to where you are now and got interested in the work that you do.
Absolutely. So I've cooked for as long as I can remember, and I graduated college and I had a corporate job, and this is in the dinosaur age of food blogging. But I started a blog like .blogspot at the very beginning, and got a cookbook deal really early on, which was so amazing. And I hate it when women say I was lucky, but it was kind of like the right niche at the right time. And so I quit my corporate job and kind of took on this weird assortment of odd food jobs to make it work. And
Wait,
then
tell me some of the odd food jobs I need to know.
I mean, just teaching classes in people's homes, which was really funny in New York. At first I thought I was going to get murdered every single time, just like showing up alone at these strangers' houses. But that was actually one of the more fun things I did. And I don't know, just food styling, private chefing, catering, like really anything that involved food. And then I had this diagnosis. I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune disease that affects your thyroid gland. And it was by my normal childhood PCP. And, in retrospect, I know that I was really lucky to be diagnosed at all. But I was 22, so I was really naive and immature. And my doctor was like, it's no big deal. It's very common for women your age. You'll just have to be on this medication for the rest of your life. And I was like, record scratch. What?
What do you mean?
And I think, I had the right idea that, just taking a pill as a Band-Aid fix was not going to be my path. But I also wasn't experiencing kind of any symptoms that I could link to this mysterious diagnosis. And so I just went on living my life and pretended the conversation had never happened. And then slowly kind of like wound down Health Mountain to my version of rock bottom. Also like working a lot of odd food jobs. It was very physical and exhausting, especially in New York. It's like the schlep is real. And so I have found myself like exhausted all the time. And I kind of chalked it up to just, working a really hard job. I used to like run, and I started getting these cramps like within half a block. My hair was falling out. My skin was a mess. And ultimately it was kind of the vanity aspect that got my attention. I mean, why not? So I did find my way into the office of someone with a more holistic mindset and did my first elimination diet, kind of learned that gluten and I do not get along. Didn't learn like kind of the connection with Hashimoto's at the time. But really, it was just very scary to be an aspiring food professional and to have any sort of dietary restriction on the horizon. I mean, even today, this is a long time ago, but, there was like a tiny little corner in the supermarket of gluten-free food. Now it's a whole aisle and it's great. But even today, it's kind of hard to be a food professional with any sort of dietary restrictions. So at the time, I just, kind of had to pivot both personally and professionally. And I just went down the rabbit hole as like a 20-something of trying to figure out how to balance these kind of extreme holistic laundry list of things that I was being told to change about my life with, kind of the Western side of things, which is, food doesn't matter. It's not medicine. But I don't know. I think because I was a chef and I loved food so much, my point of view was like, okay, well, food is medicine, but it's not just medicine.
Yeah.
How can I find this balance between, my life of hedonism and this new path of health? And that kind of became the subject of my second book. I ended up designing this whole my life as a guinea pig experiment of different things to change across a whole spectrum of wellness topics.
What's your second book called?
The Wellness Project.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So you just did different experiments on yourself and saw what happened.
It was inspired by Gretchen Rubin's The Happiness Project. But I was like, how can we take this kind of semi-type A approach?
Yeah.
And, not my hypothesis, but my goal wasn't to be 100% better. It was really to find that sweet spot where health and hedonism overlapped and where I could just kind of let go of a lot of the shame and the guilt about the things I wasn't doing and latch onto the many self-care practices that actually did bring me joy and have, a real impact on my physical health.
And what were some of the practices that you found when you were doing all those experiments that really made a difference for you?
Okay, well, the first month I went hard. I did.
It was like that, isn't it?
I did no added sugar, no caffeine, and no alcohol, cold turkey. And it was really interesting. I found sugar to actually be the hardest. And it's, definitely part of the subject matter of this book right now in terms of how to find that balance. So it wasn't something that I knew I was going to be, cold turkey for the rest of my life. The idea was always to find moderation after. But I had this horrible perioral dermatitis issue.
Yes.
Do you know it?
Well, how long did you cut out sugar for?
Just a month.
And what were the effects that you found
Okay,
after
well,
cutting out sugar?
I had perioral dermatitis on and off since high school. So for almost 10 years. And, I just would go through the revolving door of the dermatologist's office. They'd give me an antibiotic or a steroid or a cream and it would be better. But then a few weeks later, it would come back. So I was just on this merry-go-round for so long. And I'm sure doing catastrophic damage to my gut.
What were
in
the symptoms you were seeing on your face for perioral dermatitis?
It was just literally a rash shadow.
I've had that.
Yeah. It's
little bumps on your skin. Very tiny.
I think
but
it's worse
rough.
than acne because you can't cover it up.
No, even when you cover it, it still looks rough under the skin.
Yeah, there's no makeup that could combat that. So I have my before and after pictures. It was really, really bad. And this was kind of the first thing I did besides whatever my dermatologist told me to do. And I kid you not, it was gone by the end of the month, smooth skin, and never really came back, which was the amazing thing.
I have to tell you, I'm on day 16 of no added sugar. It's the first time I'm ever been able to do it.
Wow,
first
good for
time
you.
ever. I would normally give up on day one. I used to find it so difficult. I actually don't really have
It is the
caffeine.
hardest thing. It's so not in your head.
No,
it's
it is
biological.
100% a drug. Sugar is 100% a drug.
Yes.
And I gave it up because normally I'll say I'm giving up. And then day one, I'll feel really stressed at the end of the day. And I'm just fine, I'll just have a spoon of something. But what I'd realized was whenever I get into those moments, for me, eating has always been linked to my emotions.
Of course.
And so sugar, because I was well, I don't drink alcohol. I never have.
Yeah.
I don't do caffeine. Okay, fine, let me just have a bit of sugar. Is it that bad? But it actually is just as bad. And so what I would start noticing was after every meal, my body would tell me, even if I was so full, it's time to have a sugary snack. And day one, I made it through day one. After day one, it got so much easier. I was oh, wow, okay, I made it to day one. And I wouldn't tell myself I'm doing it for a certain amount of time. I was I'm just going to see how it goes. Let's do day at a time. Because every time I would tell myself I'm giving up for a month, I'd be my body would suddenly panic. But I had this rash, that same kind of dermatitis on my forehead. It would not go. It was all these tiny bumps. I got facials. I got
it's
hydrofacials, the
try
exfoliation.
From the outside in, but it doesn't always work.
I did it all 3 to 4 days in. And by the way, this had been going on and off for a while. And it kept coming and going. So I was I wonder what's causing this. I kind of wasn't even expecting it to go away from the sugar. But I literally, 4 days in, I was hold on. I looked at my skin. My skin is so much better.
I mean, you look gorgeous. You're glowing.
Thank you. So are you. But it made such a difference. Wow. And I think what happens with sugar is it really dulls you from the inside. And I know you were saying you made changes because of aesthetics before.
Yeah.
But in Ayurveda, it talks about how your skin, your hair, all the extremities of your body that you can see, all the externals that you can see, they are the things that are basically showing up to tell you there is something wrong.
Yeah.
So it will start telling you from the inside and you might not listen.
Yep.
But as soon as you start seeing it on the outside, that just shows that it's got to that level where it's had to show up on the outside to tell you, I'm screaming at you now to tell you something is wrong in my body. I need you to listen. And so, yes, you may have done it because of externals, but really it's your externals telling you your internals have to change. And so,
and our skin is our biggest organ. And it is, besides, what happens in the bathroom, like the quickest exit ramp for anything that's causing inflammation or just not agreeing with us.
I really noticed that when my gut is a little bit upset, I will sweat more. And not to be too much, but it will smell worse. And I will definitely notice a difference between when I eat out or eat certain oils when I'm out, eat certain like foods, and then how my sweat is the next day. Or when I'm working out, I'm like, oh God, I don't normally smell like this, but today I do. So I think it's a really good indication actually. Okay, so your new book is called Carbivore.
Yes.
Love the name.
Back to the subject of sugar and all the good things.
Carbivore, let me just tell you, I have and always will be a carbaholic. I love carbohydrates so much. I grew up when my mum would buy fresh, incredible bread at the beginning of the week. She would have to hide the bread from me. No. She would actually have a cupboard that she hid the bread. Eventually, thank goodness, I figured out what cupboard it was. But she would hide the bread because she'd buy a loaf, and by midday, a quarter of the loaf would have gone because all I wanted was butter and bread. So I loved the name of your book. But more than that, I wanted to ask you. So I love that you wrote a book about carbohydrates because I wanted to ask why you think carbs have been so demonized in society these days. And I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, there have been different like flavors of low carb diets over the years. There was like Atkins in the 90s. But I do think that where we're at today with like the extreme vilification, it is in part because of where we went wrong in the 90s. It's not completely out of nowhere. It's not for no reason. Like in the 90s when we, went low fat, what happened was the carb count and everything we ate just went up exponentially. So kind of the example that I give is with just, like whole milk yogurt. When you take out the fat, lactose is an actual sugar. So the sugars just go way up in that. And, as a result, we also have less fat, less protein to kind of slow our carbs roll to our bloodstream. So kind of my theme with this book is I say it's slow carb, not low carb, because it's really just about how the carbs can interact in a more productive way in our body. But yeah, in terms of, the way that our industrialized food system has changed, the way grains have changed. I think that conversation as it's grown has just spurred more and more fear around carbs.
Yeah.
And I honestly think that, where we've kind of gone wrong is that we've separated kind of the carb conversation from the conversation around sugar.
Yeah.
So you'll see kind of people in the low carb movement or people who are paleo, they're making cookies, with almond flour, sure, that like lowers the carb count, but then putting, just as much honey or maple syrup or anything into them. And so the question is it actually having an impact at all on our blood sugar, which, if we're gonna hone in on the carb conversation and, what's changed over the years, like, of course, like obesity is soaring, diabetes is soaring. So it's not like there's no problem and that carbs didn't play any role in it. But in terms of how we can change things and how we can eat the foods that we love without having such a negative impact on our bodies, I think there is kind of a middle road there that doesn't require such an intense omission. And I feel like with any omission, I mean, you kind of said a little bit with the sugar element, it's really hard to go cold turkey on something long-term, especially like for women. Yeah. Our bodies are really, really sensitive. So finding, a practical way to have moderation in our life, I think is actually really healthier long-term.
So true. I have to caveat me saying I've given up sugar with saying my saving grace has been stewed apples. Like stewing fruit, adding on some like yogurt on top and like having something like that, just knowing that I have an option that is somewhat sweet was really helpful.
I kept whole fruit in for my experiments.
Yeah, definitely.
Well.
I think that makes such a difference. You mentioned that I find really interesting that you said low fat ends up being higher carbohydrates.
Yeah.
And I think labels are really tricky. Like these days, labels are so tricky because you see one thing and it says low fat, gluten-free. It was naturally gluten-free in the first place.
Of course.
But like low fat, gluten-free, 0% cholesterol, nothing has cholesterol in it anyway. But the labels that you see, so you can see something with all these no added this, no this, but you don't realize what it's actually saying.
Right.
You don't realize what's actually in the product to make it that way. And so I find even with a lot of gluten-free products at the beginning, my family have some autoimmune disorders. And so a lot of people in my family have given up gluten. And this was 10 or more years ago. And so, yeah,
You're in my camp, the sad gluten-free girl camp.
where there was really not that many options. And what were the options were things which were gluten-free but had ridiculous ingredients you didn't even know or understand.
Highly processed.
Highly
foods.
processed.
Yes,
Definitely
not
gotten
quote
better.
unquote healthier.
Yes, exactly. But do you find, you mentioned the keto diet. Is the keto diet a good diet and is it sustainable?
Okay, my biggest pet peeve with the wellness zeitgeist, the wellness world, is that a lot of these diets are data backed, but for a therapeutic application. So for a short-term period. And I think anything can be helpful in a short-term period. But that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a lifestyle. And, if you're someone who's done keto and it works for you long-term, great. Also caveat, like a lot of these studies are not done on women. Yeah, but I think, again, when we go on any of these short-term sprints, it leaves room for falling off the wagon. And I think, a lot of people really struggle with disordered eating, and that's not talked enough about with these extreme diets. So ketosis is like a really intense thing to put your body through to find fuel from within to turn fat into readily available energy. And again, especially for women in their childbearing years, that's a lot of stress to put the body under.
Right.
And a lot of women, will lose their periods or find changes to their cycle that, should be a big red flag that this diet is not necessarily productive. So there are other ways, again, to kind of go about it. And that's not to say that, a short-term period of keto, if you have some sort of gut dysfunction or insulin sensitivity, that it can't be helpful for you. But like, that's the whole point of a therapeutic diet, is kind of to do a short-term sprint and then avoid the place where you kind of reach a point of diminishing returns.
So would you say carbohydrates are an essential part of a body to survive and be healthy? And what are the repercussions of, removing carbohydrates from the body? Because I know you mentioned people losing their menstrual cycle or women losing their menstrual cycle. Is there a link between carbohydrates and women's hormones?
Absolutely. So first of all, when we say carbs, it's kind of slang for starch.
Yes.
Bread, potatoes, grains, what we think of as traditional carbs. But carbohydrates is a macronutrient that literally includes all plants on Earth. So, I can get into a sparring war with some carnivores out there, but I personally believe that the majority of the data points to the fact that we would, be exponentially increasing our mortality rate if we took out all plants from our diet. So, when we talk about low carb, and keto is, again, an extreme version of this that includes a lot of starchy vegetables. But, most of the time we're just talking about reducing starch. However, I personally am of the belief, and my third book was all about gut health, that like diversity is the spice of life. Our gut health is so important for our overall health, our immune system, our mood, so many different functions. And we know that how to, kind of foster as diverse an ecosystem as possible within our body is to eat as diverse, an array of plants as possible. So I think that's kind of the central argument against going too low carb, because, just like what we said about low fat, increasing carbs, when we reduce, our plate and take away a major macronutrient or take away, a whole swath of plants, we're taking away our diversity and we're increasing increasing the ratios of other things that might be healthy in moderation, but aren't once they start taking up too big a quadrant. So I think that's, one argument. And then second of all is women's hormones. We need readily available glucose, our simplest form of energy, to make certain hormones, and especially for all my thyroid girlies out there, to make our thyroid hormones.
Wow.
So yeah, there have been some studies about keto and going super low carb for people with thyroid issues that can show, it can actually increase some of those really annoying symptoms of hypothyroidism, like the fatigue, because again, like our body can't catch up. And, there's always kind of, a Goldilocks issue for everyone. I think it's the point of the book and the point of this conversation is that, super low carb and super high carb, are not useful for the average person.
Yeah.
Like the average person needs to fall somewhere in the middle.
And what would you say is considered super low carb? Like what is too low?
I mean, keto is, one of the lowest.
So complete
carb.
removal.
Yeah, or carnivore.
It's so funny. I knew this person who, there was this guy that I knew and he was such, wait, what's it called? Not carbivore. I'm thinking
Carnivore.
of carnivore. I was like, wait, he wasn't a carnivore. He was such a carnivore that he would only eat meat. He literally believed that vegetables and fruits were really bad for you. And I guess there is a big following in that. I didn't realize that at the time.
Yeah.
But to the point where he would get his meals prepped and sent to him, and everything would come out of plastic packaging, and it was all meals that you warm up in the microwave, but all pure meat base. And I was like, wait, do you not eat vegetables? He's like, no, vegetables are really bad for you. And I'm like, what about your microbiome?
Yeah.
What about your gut? Do you poo? Like, what's happening? Like, what's happening with your gut? I need to know the details because I cannot understand how you're functioning with such low fiber, because really when you cut out carbohydrates and vegetables, you're so low in fiber. And then on top of that, you have such an extreme level of protein. And whenever I've tried to increase my protein, or I've had other people have, it really does take a while for your gut to adapt to that level of protein in the body.
Yeah.
Sometimes your body can't even process that amount. So there you are with your high protein, zero fiber, and no fruits and vegetables. So where are you getting your nutrients from?
No, probably like supplements.
I didn't win the argument because he was a serious carnivore.
Yeah.
But I was like, I can't put my head around it.
No, and I'm so glad you brought up fiber because fiber is a carbohydrate. Yes. So I get really annoyed with people who, talk about low carb and, they're like, it's just, to have more plants on your plate. I'm like, okay, yeah, fiber is super important. It's super important for kind of improving our carb tolerance, but it is a carbohydrate. So like you can't be super low, quote unquote, carb.
Have you heard of lots of products now saying net carbs?
No.
Oh my gosh. So it's so interesting. I've been seeing this quite a bit. I don't want to shout out. I don't want to scrutinize any specific brands. I'll tell you later.
Okay, great.
But there are some brands who will say 4 grams net carbs. And what they've now been doing is counting the carbs based on removing soluble fiber or something. Like they don't count the soluble fiber. And so they'll have bagels or breads or things like that they say 4 grams net carbs. And then you look at the back and it says total carbs minus the fiber. And so you have 4 grams of net carbs. And it's a weird label that they've now brought out because I'm like, you still got your 30 grams of carbs in that bagel.
Right. I mean, I understand what they're going for.
Okay, please explain it because I can't.
Not wrong per se, but it's kind of doing the math for people. If you're trying to eat a processed food, that has the ingredient list on the back and a label, you kind of want it to reflect the reality of a whole food. So, fruits, let's say, have 5 times as much sugar as fiber. So it's like a 1 to 5 ratio. So anything that kind of exceeds that, you're like, oh, that's way too high sugar.
Right.
In terms of starches, I'm not quite sure. The ratio kind of ranges depending on what it is. But so that's one way to think about it is that the fiber is kind of offsetting the carbs to a certain extent.
Okay.
And I don't know, but it can be misleading. That's the problem with packaged foods is that fiber that is pulverized into microscopic bits, it doesn't have the protective effects as even the fiber that's in a fructose enhanced food like whole fruit. Right. So what fiber does is essentially it's a chain of glucose. So again, carbohydrate. But that chain can't be broken down again. So that glucose never enters our system through the small intestine. It just carries on and goes to our large intestine, where it has an extremely important function of feeding our good gut critters. It's their favorite food. But along the way, it kind of creates this sludge in our small intestines. It's like kind of a gross visual. But, all those seeds, all those skins form an actual protective layer so that whatever carbs, whatever simple sugars come into our system can't just like go through like a fine mesh sieve, like a waterfall. It's going to be much more of like a drip, a slow carb effect rather than an unobstructed stream. So that's kind of the reason why carbs have gotten a bad name, the reason why carbs have, in the highly processed food era caused a lot more damage is simply because the fiber has been removed, or we've kind of, we haven't learned how to incorporate that fiber in a productive way, like eating a salad before our meal, or in Italy, like an antipasti, or in Japan, the edamame,
Yes.
If you look at different cultures, there are examples of how fiber can be protective for our body that are just kind of baked into the cuisines.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I understand the concept behind it, but at the same time, I think a lot of labels are used to mislead. And that's the fine line where it's like, are you actually saying it to help?
Yeah.
Or are you saying it to mislead so that people buy it and think that it's something that it's not?
Yeah. So in the case of processed food, like if we're looking at, a red lentil pasta versus a regular whole wheat pasta, or just a regular white pasta, the fiber on the back of the package is going to be much higher because there's so much naturally occurring dietary fiber in legumes. However, it's been pulverized into the point of flour to make the noodles. You're not going to have that in the small intestine as a protective measure. Like it's not going to slow our carbs roll at all to our bloodstream. It may feed our gut critters to a certain extent once it gets to large intestine, but no, anything, it's another reason why, smoothies, if we're, throwing all these whole fruits into a smoothie, it's also not going to have as much of that protective effect. Since I'm a cook, I like to use the visual of
I love that.
what literally happens if you muddle like raspberries in a sieve. I have a recipe in the book for like a raspberry lime curd tart.
Yum.
And so make the tart and just like think about actually the lessons of your blood sugar metabolism as you do it. But no, if you try and push that raspberry through the sieve, again, it's going to get clogged with all those seeds and whatnot. But if you were to puree those raspberries in a high-speed blender, it's going to go through the sieve a lot more quickly. And again, not create that helpful sludge.
Wait, that's so true. So would you say that a lot of these, because I eat lentil pasta, I have to get higher protein in.
Yeah.
But I wonder, even when it comes to protein powders, for example, if the protein is manipulated in that way and pulverized to a certain extent and created into powders, would you say that has a different effect to having proteins that are from beans, pulse, lentils?
Well, I think everything does. Everything goes through a degree of processing unless it's a literal whole food.
Yeah, exactly.
An almond is very different than almond flour, than almond milk. Again, almond milk, I guess on the back of the package is higher fiber, but you kind of know, that's not really that's not the way fiber is meant to function. So it's not to say not to eat these things and that, protein powder or lentil pasta isn't a good source of fiber or protein if you're looking at your macros. I'm not sure, I would love to think a little bit more about the protein powder question, because kind of the way, in terms of our blood sugar, the way that, protein kind of functions is, and same with fat, is to kind of slow down the emptying of our stomach. So again, it's just like slowing down the digestive process, which, by the way, if you have certain issues, that's not necessarily a good thing. Certain acute gut issues, kind of are problems of stagnation. My third book was all about SIBO and IBS. And so there's kind of like a different lesson plan for that community. But I'm curious, when the work is done for your body before the food enters the body, naturally, I think it's to some degree, in a good way, easier to assimilate. Yeah, exactly. But again, when it comes to your blood sugar, that can be kind of like a different goal set.
Yes, definitely. What do you think, with a lot of these protein powders, just reminded me, have a lot of alternate sweeteners and monk fruit, or do all of those, is there enough evidence to show that they actually don't spike your blood sugar levels? And are there some negative effects with stevia, monk fruit, all these additional sweeteners that are now put into products to say they're low sugar?
Yeah, so stevia and monk fruit are probably the best from, a blood sugar perspective. I do think, and I don't know if you've found this in your experiments, but there is an addictiveness to sweetness, it doesn't have the same impact on our brain, but our taste buds for sure. Yeah. So I do think, people have to think about that a little bit with, it can be a baby step for people in the right direction, of course, to replace like certain types of sugar with even like quote unquote natural sweeteners or, stevia and monk fruit. But I am glad that you're kind of, looking at, tuned in and aware of what happens at the end of the meal, because I had to do that too. And I like to analyze, like, why do I want something sweet? What am I really craving here? Yeah. Is it comfort? Is it like just to signal to myself that the meal is over? Is it like, a reward at the end of the day?
All of the above.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. I think it's just worth processing and being aware of like how we use certain foods emotionally.
I just didn't want to have something that had that much control over me. Yeah. I think that's what it was. Like, I feel like I'm able to be quite regimented in other areas of my life, but food has always been something which I'm so happy about, that I love and have so much interest in, but at the same time has had a lot of control over me emotionally from a young age. And so when I do get to a point where I'm like telling myself you don't need it, but I still end up having it, that to me is like, I'm not in control anymore. Yeah. Like, I'm not in control of my body, of what it wants, of what it needs. It's skewed because my senses have overtaken my body and my mind. And I think that's what throws me off, where I'm like, my body is actually telling me what it needs. My mind is telling me what's right for me, but my senses overtake that and say, no, I need a chocolate. No, you have to have this because, and you just start trying to convince your body and your mind of why you deserve it or why you need it. And so I think that ends up being a tricky kind of cycle that you get trapped into. And the next thing you know, every single night, you're like reaching for something sweet. Yeah. And I think having something small, totally okay. I think I just needed to know that I wasn't dependent on it.
Totally. And having these resets, again, like therapeutic short-term sprints are so important because it like breaks the cycle. It gives us a little bit of a reset. So even if you kind of, creep back to,
once a week, I'm like, I'm going to have a little treat here and there. But I feel like now I know that I won't necessarily go all in. Yeah. And I know I can get away from it, which is great.
Absolutely. You're totally capable. If you ever need a reset, it's there for you.
Yeah, exactly. In your book, you talk about your like top sources of carbohydrates, or like the best type of sources. What would you say are the top 3 sources of carbohydrates that you recommend people should have? Because I think you have 8 categories, right?
Yeah, I have. So the book is organized by type of carb. Yeah. I like, I think the beauty of carbs is that they're affordable for a lot of people. Yeah. They're pantry stable. Kind of the idea for this book, what became out of the pandemic, because so many people were like in need of rounding out their meals every week with these shelf stable carbs. And I think a lot of people like who are home cooking for the first time, like actually had a better relationship with them on the other end. People who are making sourdough bread and whatnot. But I would say, I'm talking about carbohydrates, like vegetables, fiber-rich vegetables. Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of using seeds and nuts in various combinations. There are 5 different recipes for nut and seed sprinkles, which are like a great way to just add instead of take away. That's kind of always my philosophy. It's
nice,
like, how can we,
bits.
How can we add things that are, going to create more flavor, more texture, make our meals more delicious, and kind of, I guess, according to the math of the food labels these days, offset the carbs. Yeah. But really, it's just about slowing them down. Yeah. So I would say those. And then, whole grains, again, in terms of, kind of hedging your bets plant-wise. I mean, buckwheat is super nutritious, quinoa, millet, all these different ancient grains that have been around for a while and aren't that different today than they were in their quote unquote ancient iterations. But I also have, I have potatoes, which like the skin of potatoes has a huge amount of fiber in them. They have a lot of resistant starch. There's also ways that you can, hack your carbs to have more resistant starch and whatnot. But really the book, there's a place for everything. So there's bread, there's pasta. It's kind of about feeding your cravings while again, kind of like adding more of, the healthy fats and the lean protein and the fiber and the nut and seed sprinkles that, up the nutrition nutrition value and then also slow the carbs down.
What are your favorite secret but not so secret carb hacks?
Oh my gosh. So the resistant starch is one of them. So resistant starch is really similar to fiber in the body. So again, it's a type of starch, i.e. a type of carb, quote unquote complex carb, but it can't be broken down again. So again, it passes through our system and feeds our good gut critters in our large intestine. And most, raw carbs have, a certain degree of resistant starch and they lose it once they get cooked. So for example, if you're doing an overnight oat preparation, like raw oats, that's going to be higher in resistant starch than cooking the oats. However, if you cool your cooked carbs down afterwards, even if you reheat them again, you're going to have a higher percentage of resistant starch. It helps kind of redevelop the resistant starch. So lowering the carb count in your food, and then again, creating something that's like yummy, happy food for our gut critters. And I'm not crazy about any of these things. I like to just live in the world and not have the mental monkeying around carbs. But I do think to myself, when I make pasta and I eat it the next day, I'm like, oh, this is going to be, a little bit, I'm going to be a little steadier from this. I maybe, don't have to add such a huge portion of salad or vegetables to my plate to offset this.
So cold leftover pizza is better.
It's a health food.
It's perfect. So I'm going to always buy my pizza and then leave it the next day and eat it the next day. Great. Yes. Cold pizza is always better.
I know. So you don't have to be crazy about it. You don't have to every time you make pasta, I'm going to freeze it and then reheat it immediately in one fell swoop. No, it's just something to think about. And then also legumes have a huge percentage of resistant starch and dietary fiber. And
you mentioned in Europe having having your veggies and stuff before your carbs, right? That's exactly a great one. Why do you think oats have become such a hot point lately? I've just been seeing so many reels and videos about people just hating on oats, and I'm like, but oats have been so great for so long. Why do we hate them now?
They're a whole grain. I mean, I think there's the pesticide side of the pesticide side of the conversation. Oat milk has really come under fire. And I do think that one, holds
I get that.
weight. I get that. But again, it's that's a highly processed version of the oats. The quick microwave packets of instant oats. Again, that's taking the whole oat, but pulverizing it more, cutting it down into smaller pieces so it cooks faster. So again, kind of the steel cut oat, which is, not pressed versus the quick cooking oat, those are going to have different effects on the body. So I mean, again, the slow carb idea is oftentimes convenience is, going to make something a little bit less good for your blood sugar.
So people shouldn't people don't have to cut out the oats.
No. And then oat milk, I actually think it's delicious. It's one of the creamier plant-based milks, but it is higher carb. And I think people who use it first thing in the morning on an empty stomach in their coffee or their tea or cereal, that's what we have to look at. I still have it in some of my baked goods because I'm it's going to make a really good cake and you're eating cake. So
exactly. Either way.
Get over it. But, we know that when we have simple sugars or carbs that are, really quickly assimilated on an empty stomach, they can reach our bloodstream within 5 minutes. And that is going to have the biggest impact in the morning because we've fasted overnight. So our stomach couldn't be emptier than it is first thing in the morning. And when we have, any sort of volatility in the morning in terms of our blood sugar, it's going to have kind of a negative halo effect later in the day. So it's just, again, it's about thinking about how we change our habits around certain ingredients, how we eat certain things, not necessarily the what of it all, and removing that entirely.
I asked some of my audience on Instagram, the community on Instagram, about some questions that they wanted to know about carbohydrates. And one of them that came up a lot was, can I really increase my muscle and reduce my fat percentage by still eating carbohydrates? And it's so interesting that people have such a people really believe that carbohydrates can prevent you from doing that. What's your perspective on that?
It's really funny. So I'm not a practitioner of any sort, and I'm certainly not an extreme sportsman or bodybuilder in any way. So in terms of building muscle, I can't really speak to that so much. But so many athletes, carb load. They eat a ton of carbs. And it's kind of one situation where, you're moving your muscles a lot. You're using the machinery of your body where you can get away with eating more carbs because you actually do need more readily accessible energy. So I have a couple experiments in the book for you to kind of see how carbs affect you. But one of them is, again, on an empty stomach in the morning, like eating kind of a high carb breakfast and then going for, a 10, 15-minute walk or before a workout and seeing how that same food affects you, with the exercise after versus just being sedentary. And that's not to say you need to, work off your calories, work off your carbs. I do not live my life according to that. And I would never put that out into the world. But it's just, again, thinking about, our muscles are using fuel from our body. So if we're using them in any sort of capacity, any, energy that's hanging out in our bloodstream is going to get gobbled up more quickly. So, a lot of marathoners or extreme athletes are, having those like sugar gels. Like that's not a health food, but they need it actually to fuel really long runs. So I'm actually curious about athletes who are super low carb because I think it's not necessary. As if I'm obsessed with tennis. We talked about this a little bit before. And there are like Italian tennis players who are like, I've literally never had a meal that didn't involve pasta.
So good. So good. I mean, that feels like a good way to be an athlete.
Yeah.
Eat all the pasta you want.
And they're like stick thin and like full, like pure muscle.
Why do you think that carbs make people feel so lethargic and heavy? Because I find that a lot. Most people feel, and I get that. If I eat too many carbohydrates at lunchtime, I definitely get that downward crash. Yeah.
So that's totally just a blood sugar thing.
Yes.
So like what goes up must come down. And I feel like there's a lot of talk about blood sugar spikes in the wellness world. And it's not a pet peeve of mine per se, but I do think we're getting like a little bit too focused on that. Because really the idea is that we want as little volatility as possible.
Yes.
So we don't want huge spikes, huge declines all the time. We kind of want to like flatten the curve a little bit, but naturally every time we eat, our blood sugar is going to go up and down. It's the nature of the beast. Even if we're eating, like a handful of almonds, like it's still going to go up and down. So I think it's, again, just looking at what else we're doing, what else we're adding to those carbs, what we're doing afterwards. If you do feel yourself have that blood sugar crash afterwards, because, that's not great. We don't want to have uneven energy. We don't want to have to take a nap under our desk midday. And we don't want to have cravings, by 3:00 in the afternoon, so far away from dinner.
So maybe that's a good sign for people that if they are feeling that way, I imagine that's maybe you are having maybe too many carbs or you're not eating them in the right way.
Yeah,
so that could be a good sign that it doesn't mean that you have to cut them out. Either do some of the hacks that you recommended or take a walk after. I find that helps me. As soon as I've eaten my main meal or like my afternoon meal, I'll get on the treadmill or just walk taking my next meeting. And I definitely don't get that extreme low after my meal.
And it doesn't have to be exercise. You can just like walk up the stairs once or twice. It's just doing little small things.
Would you say is there a best time to eat carbohydrates in your day?
I think it's, again, there's kind of like a Goldilocks system, but probably later in the day. Actually, kind of one of the side effects that some people experience with keto is keto insomnia. It's a thing. And so, at dinner time, it's, again, a little bit of a balance to find because going super low carb can affect our sleep. But then, of course, you don't want to have a blood sugar spike, while you're actually under the covers. So it's figuring out a nice happy medium there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is there, have you seen any research based on whether people should be having carbohydrates before they work out or not, and whether that benefits it? I've always been interested in that correlation.
I don't know about the benefit, but I would think that would be the best time to have them, honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
Before a workout. And the worst time we do know is in the morning. So if there's ever a time to kind of focus a little bit more on protein or healthy fats, or at least making sure we have those things and fiber on our plate in addition to the carbs, it would be first thing in the morning. And it's also, a time that, culturally we're most used to eating sugar. So it's really just breaking up with that idea. And again, it's like, I want to redirect the conversation. For most people, it's not about reducing the carbs. It's about reducing the sugar.
Yes.
We can just start off by having anything that follows a more savory avenue in the morning and like put our best foot forward.
I was actually at dinner yesterday, and 3 people around the table told me that they had SIBO. I would love for you to explain SIBO and any advice that you have for people out there based on it, because it seems to be very common.
It's very common. And so what happens with SIBO is it's called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And it's kind of an issue of location, not type. So you have bacteria that's colonizing too far up in your intestinal tract. So our small intestine, again, is where we absorb our nutrients. So there's really no role for bacteria to be there. They're competing for our food resources there. And then more importantly, when they eat our food, they're releasing gas. And in the small intestine so far up, there's no easy exit ramp anymore. So that gas gets trapped. Kind of the hallmark symptoms of SIBO are really uncomfortable, like inner tube, like distension and bloating. And then, kind of other classic IBS symptoms like issues, with diarrhea or constipation. But it can be really, really hard to eradicate for people. And again, one of these chronic problems that can cause so much misery. And a lot of people, with SIBO do get like very fearful of food because it's not in their head the fact that the symptoms are a direct correlation of eating food. That's absolutely true, but it's just that the bacteria is in the wrong place. So unfortunately, a lot of people will have to go through, some sort of treatment plan that actually kills the bacteria. And adopting some strategies to kind of encourage it to move to the right place. But, kind of the hypothesis with SIBO and why it occurs for a lot of people is that there's some sort of stagnation. So our small intestines are 25 feet long, like more surface area than a football field.
Wow.
It's very easy for anything to get lost in the labyrinth there, for bacteria to like pull off the side of the highway and be like, oh, I'm going to like stay a while. There's a lot of food here, and build a little colony. But what kind of is our preventative measure in our body is this nerve wave called the migrating motor complex. And when I wrote the Wellness Project, I did a ton of research on gut health, and I did not come across, this very essential function. And so what happens is it essentially is like a street sweeper wave that clears debris after a meal. So, we have, muscles that move the food through, but then again, through this long, windy, craggy area of the body, we need something that kind of sweeps the decks. And that's what the migrating motor complex does. And what I find so interesting about it, and why I'm always talking about it, is that it doesn't kick in unless you're in a fasting state of 90 minutes or more. So a lot of people who are snacking all the time, and again, like we're in a culture that encourages that, around every corner, advertises it, in every food commercial that we should be snacking. There's a lot of people say you have to have lots of little meals throughout the day versus, 3 main ones. And maybe that works for you, but in terms of how your migrating motor complex works, this, biological process, you're not going to be getting that benefit, that street sweeper wave. So I wouldn't say that that is like a main cause of SIBO. There are so many comorbidities. There's so many kind of catalysts. But in terms of thinking about how we eat versus what we eat, I think it's an important thing to keep in the back of the mind. And I think it's a really interesting place where what we know about our blood sugar overlaps with what we know about our digestive health. Because again, that volatility, if we're eating all the time, even if it's something healthy, we're requiring a lot of energy from our organs. We're requiring just a lot of processes to happen over and over and over again. So personally, I'm not so into intermittent fasting, but I do try and space my meals out. And I do try and, take a look at what's going on with my meals and my blood sugar if I can't make it, 4 hours until dinner time. Because that's kind of a sign, again, that you have to work a little bit on your blood sugar in order to get there.
So that makes so much sense, because that's why in Ayurveda, it talks about having a minimum of 3-hour gap between your meals, minimum of 3 hours. And, but it's never been explained to me like that. But it also makes sense because it says that when you end up eating again, after your body is still processing food and still eliminating food from your body, it increases the likelihood of toxins building up, which is similar to what you're saying.
Yeah.
The toxins build up in your gut, in your body. And so then those toxins end up causing gas, bloating, and all those other bits, because it's basically the food is fermenting in your stomach. You're not giving it enough time to fully process through.
Absolutely.
Oh my God, that's wild.
And then you're giving the bacteria even more reason to stick around.
Yeah, I didn't realize that mechanism doesn't kick in till 90 minutes after you eat.
And I will say there are all these other things that can cause dysfunction with the migrating motor complex. Hashimoto's being one of them. A lot of autoimmune issues being part of that picture. A lot of people with celiac disease also, kind of have issues with their motility. But yeah, that's kind of like a big piece of the pie in people who get SIBO. And I will also say, because, it's kind of cold season, flu season, any sort of food poisoning or like stomach bug, you may not notice it in the moment. Well, you'll notice it in the moment. You'll be miserable in the moment in terms of a stomach bug. But, a week later, you may feel back to normal. But it's what happens 3 weeks or a month after that, once our nerve damage has had the time to kind of kick in and the stagnation builds over time. And then it becomes really hard for people to connect any sort of digestive issues with what happened like a month before.
That's what happened to my friend. She was saying that yesterday 2 people said they got food poisoning and then directly after that got SIBO. So what's the difference between SIBO and IBS then?
So a lot of specialists say that there's a pretty big overlap.
Okay.
IBS is kind of this like blanket Band-Aid diagnosis. It's really just a collection of symptoms. It's not really an explanation for why they're happening. And so a lot of people do think that SIBO, covers a large portion of the IBS population. But there are other things too. These, yeast or fungal overgrowth, SIFO, and, many other things that it can be. SIBO is becoming one of the easier ones to test for. So I think that's why it's feeling more common, especially as awareness grows within the medical community and people think to test for it. But it's not always the only thing. And then there is often an overlap, with a fungal or yeast overgrowth too, because it's really a mechanical issue.
Yes.
So anything can overgrow if you have, the mechanical issue.
What can people do to avoid getting SIBO? Are there specific foods not to eat?
No. So I think it's less, again, about the foods and more about just like keeping your motility in the back of your mind, changing how you eat. I say like chewing your food. It's like such a common sense thing, but like we really don't do it. And, just giving our digestive system the leg up that it was intended to have versus like, swallowing our food whole.
Which so many of us do. I literally have to consciously sit and tell myself, I suddenly notice how I'm chewing and I'm take 5 bites and I'm swallowing it. And my granddad always used to say, we have to take like 30 bites before you swallow. And I'd watch him and he would be really particular about it, make all of us do it. And
my
now
grandmother was the same way. She was like the last person by a half an hour at the table. We were all like,
yes. But imagine how good their digestion was.
Yes. So I think that's something to pay attention to. And then honestly, like our sleep and our stress levels, they really do affect our motility. They affect our digestion. They affect our blood sugar. And then, I'll just like caveat some things that were said earlier, because now that we're talking about SIBO, you'll understand why. But some people with SIBO, blood sugar may come second. Like you may want to have those smoothies or those, pureed soups, broths, things that are kind of easier, again, that like don't require so much work for your digestive system, because it is, under fire. It's not functioning optimally to begin with.
You mentioned intermittent fasting earlier. And in your book, you say that especially for women, that intermittent fasting isn't recommended. So would you recommend intermittent fasting to people? Or
I think, again, there's like such a broad range of how people apply that.
Totally.
Like 12 hours, for me, that's easy. I don't even have to think about that. I usually go 12 hours. And that, for some people, is considered intermittent fasting. I don't think of it as that. I think of that as like a good spacing. But, going like 16, and basically anything that can be read by the body as starving, I don't think is helpful for women. Again, yes, it increases our stress hormones. And if we're already stressed out, which like, let's be honest, like we all are, then that's only going to kind of light some of those symptoms on fire. And then again, for women in their childbearing years, I think any sign of starvation, that's a sign in the body that it's not a good time to incubate another life. So it's just something to think about if you are trying to conceive or, have that on your mind at all.
Yeah, I think we always see stress in the physical body in terms of or in the mind. We always think of stress as being I'm anxious or I feel stressed, but I think sometimes we miss the symptoms of stress that our physical body tells us, or the things that we're doing that is putting stress on our body. And I think that mind shift is really important, because even certain workouts or exercises that women do, like high intensity interval training, actually for someone with hormonal issues, thyroid issues, actually doing these high intensity training workouts can throw off your hormones so much, can throw off so much in your body and create more stress and more harm than good. And so, I think that's really tricky, because you're like, oh, I really want to lose weight, or I really want to get fit, so I'm going to do all this intense work. And then you don't realize it's raising your cortisol levels. So what happens when your cortisol levels rise? Your body's holding on to the fat more than it usually would. And then you'll keep doing all these intense workouts and you're thinking, why am I not losing weight when I'm trying so hard, I'm eating the right foods, because your body's holding on to it. And so doing lower impact workouts, walking, sometimes you'll notice that you'll reduce all these high intense workouts, start just simply walking or doing weight training that isn't too intense, and your body's like slowly, gently letting go.
I think, most people, at least those who are kind of wellness oriented and paying attention, to a lot of these conversations, it is not high intensity anything that we need. Like, we need to be gentler. Like, everything would probably be better if we were just a little bit more gentle
living.
I
feel like I need more. I feel like as I get
a lot
to
of
the end
people
of the
with
year,
SIBO too, it's like everyone wants to muscle through it, and unfortunately, like, you kind of just have to extend the runway and be willing to just be gentle for a long stretch of time in the healing process.
Longer generally is always better. Like even in Ayurveda, it talks about how we're so used to all these quick fixes, and that's just in every single part of our life. And the problem is everything becomes faster, and then we become faster. And then our expectations, like, I mean, look, I love Amazon, but like even the fact that we're so used to like, oh, I want this and I can have it in 24 hours. But then our mind becomes like that with our body too. And it's like, but how long have you been damaging your body for? And you're expecting the result of health and wellness within 24 hours, 48 hours, a week. And so you have to think about the amount of time that you have spent harming your body potentially, and then think about at least that amount of time to help heal it. Your body will take time to get used to your new habits. And so giving yourself time is so important. Should you modify your carbohydrate intake during pregnancy and breastfeeding, or can you keep it the same?
I think I've never breastfed, but I think a lot of people actually do require more carbs, because again, you're, using a lot of energy in the body to produce breast milk to feed another thing. So I think it's, one of those areas where complex carbs are really important. And again, complex carbs just means starches, so whole grains, and adding things like that whenever possible, and just not being too, too worried about, the carb counts and things. Simple sugar. But again, it's like when you're kind of running on fumes, like you do need a little bit more help in terms of readily available energy. A lot of the time, like digestion is not where it needs to be postpartum. So just being, again, a little gentle with yourself and paying attention to what actually makes you feel fueled. You don't really want to like restrict in that time period.
That reminded me of the other thing that I had to change when it came to cutting out sugar, was also all the lifestyle habits that were surrounding that. Because if I was running from thing to thing to thing and I was in high anxiety,
you need a quick fix.
I'm like, I just need something. And so slowing down and being even if it's just a small amount of slowing down, cutting one thing out of my day, made such a difference. The pacing of my life, as I changed that, it really helped with not craving as much, and also having more time to like invest into what foods am I eating. Of course I'm going to be craving sugar because my meals weren't substantial. I didn't have the right balance of nutrients that I needed. I didn't have the right balance of all the food groups that I needed. So half an hour after that, I'm hungry again, because then I want the instant fuel because I don't have time to think about how to make other things. So that was something that really helped me too.
I would say nutrient density is something to focus on, but that doesn't mean low carb necessarily.
No, not at all.
Again, it's adding more good instead of like taking away. So add some nuts and seeds to your oatmeal.
Exactly. And you might see all the difference.
Almond butter and you'll be good.
So good. All right, myth or truth? Let's do it. Bread in Europe is better than bread in the USA. Better for you.
Okay, I would say truth. I'm really bad at yes or no questions, by the way. I'm like, but I would love to explain. But
you can. You totally can. Yeah.
So bread is a really interesting one and kind of goes back. And I actually like talking about pasta too, because a lot of people, again, I've been gluten-free for 15 years. A lot of people are like, oh, I go to Europe and I eat pasta in Italy and I feel totally fine. But when I'm here, I'm really bloated. Or I go to, France and I eat baguettes and it's like totally fine. But I eat, sandwich bread in the US and I feel like crap. And it really, I think, there is a narrative to be had about, again, how things are grown, that Roundup isn't used over there as much, but things are slipping over there as well. But I think it's more about like the artisanal methods of how we make our food. And that's why I love, why it was important to me to write a cookbook instead of just like a book about all this stuff, because how we prepare our food really does affect our blood sugar, really does affect our digestion. And, in terms of, authentic sourdough, the slow process, the slow rise time, the fermentation that takes time, our bacteria is actually eating some of the carb count. It's eating some of the gluten, and it's just maybe going to be a little bit easier to digest as a result for people and give people a little steadier blood sugar as a result. But the pasta situation, I think, is really interesting. So in Italy, the way that authentically or historically, traditionally, you make pasta is to slow dry it, sometimes outside, to get it hard. And people are saying, oh, well, like, Italian pasta is lower in gluten because of, the type of flour they use. And I'm like, no, honey, it's actually higher in gluten because it's semolina flour. It's actually a high protein, gluten's a protein, high gluten flour, because you want your pasta to have that beautiful bite and elasticity. You want it to wind around a noodle properly. So the Italians know that because they know everything. But what they do is, instead of kind of flash drying it in an industrial process, and of course, like some Italian brands do that too, I mean, industrialized food. But the difference there is in just what happens to the gluten. So if you think about how you cook, animal protein, but if you take a steak and you put it in a hot skillet, it's going to shrink up and like really, really constrict. And that's what happens with protein. So the same thing happens in our pasta when we change the temperature drastically and really quickly, is that the gluten is just going to be like much more of a tight knit sweater versus like a nice loose weave. And that's going to be a lot harder for our gut to process. So it's just one of the reasons, and it's not the only reason, but it's the one that I feel like is not talked about enough in terms of our digestive system.
So you're saying that the ones that are done industrially, the way that they do the heating process is worse because in Italy they sun dry them.
Yeah, it's just a slower process. And you can find, brands that do sell here that say lenta on the front, or it'll say slow dried. And that's just something to keep in mind.
Oh my God, that's such a good hack. Okay, slow dried pasta, everyone.
Yeah, you don't have to go to Italy. You can look on and it really is just on the supermarket shelf. You can usually find it.
That's so good to know, actually. Sourdough bread is better for you.
Yes.
Okay, great. Carbs make you bloated.
Oh, myth.
Yeah.
Myth.
All carbs cause glucose spikes.
Ooh, that's a tricky one. I mean, I would say fact, but it depends what type of carb, you know.
And glucose spikes are normal.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. There you go.
Carbs make you fat.
Again, like myth, doesn't have to. Again, it depends how high that glucose spike is going and your insulin situation.
Oh my God. Thank you so much. This has honestly been like one of the most informative. I'm so sorry I shot so many questions at you, but I thought it was such an interesting topic, and I really appreciate the way that you shared it. It made so much sense, and I feel hopefully Carbivore, your new incredible book, and this conversation will help people love carbs and their bodies a lot more.
Oh my gosh.
And I really hope that. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That's my mission. Thank you for sharing it.
Of course.